There is a version of you that you have never introduced to anyone. Not because it is evil, because you were taught, that it was unacceptable. The anger you were told to swallow, the ambition you were told was arrogance, the part of you that wanted more than you were supposed to want, the voice that said no when you said yes to keep the peace. You buried it so completely that you almost forgot it was there. Almost. But it shows up anyway. In the flash of rage you immediately apologize for, in the resentment you carry toward people you claim to have forgiven, in the dreams that embarrass you when you remember them, in the inexplicable pull toward the very things you have spent your life pretending you are above. That is not a malfunction. That is not evidence that something is wrong with you. Carl Jung, who spent his entire life mapping the parts of the human soul that everyone else was too afraid to enter, had a name for what you buried. He called it the shadow. And he said something about it that will permanently change the way you understand every relationship you have ever had, including the one you have with yourself. Before I show you what Jung discovered, I want to give you 3 things you can use today, not theory yet. 3 practices for the specific weight you have been carrying without knowing its name. The first practice, the resentment inventory. Today, take 1 page. Write down every person who has irritated you this week. Not the big enemies, the small ones. The colleague who spoke over you, the friend who canceled plans, the stranger who got something you felt you deserved. Now, for each one, ask yourself one honest question. What quality in them am I pretending I don't have? Not to punish yourself, to find yourself. Because Jung said the things that trigger you most consistently are not random. They are the map to what you have hidden. The second practice, the letter you will never send. Think of someone you have never fully said the truth to. A parent, a partner, a friend, someone you have been performing a version of yourself for. Write them a letter you will never send. Say everything. The resentment, the disappointment, the need, the boundary you should have set 3 years ago. Do not send it. Do not show it to anyone. Just write it. Because the shadow does not need an audience to be integrated. It needs acknowledgement. The moment you write the unspeakable thing, it loses half its power over you. The third practice, 1 act of chosen discomfort daily. Jung believed the shadow grows strongest in comfort, in the gap between what you actually think and what you say to keep things smooth. So today, say 1 true thing you would normally soften, not to be cruel, to be real. The specific discomfort of that moment is the shadow being acknowledged rather than suppressed. Do that once a day for 7 days and watch what changes in the way people respond to you. Try all 3 today, then come back. Because what Jung discovered about the shadow is going to change the way you understand every pattern in your life you have never been able to explain. Because Jung did not just describe what you buried, he traced exactly what happens to it while it sits down there. And what he found is both terrifying and completely liberating. Jung believed that every human being is born whole, not innocent, whole, containing everything, the capacity for gentleness and the capacity for cruelty, the drive to create and the drive to destroy, the desire to love and the desire to dominate. All of it present, all of it real, all of it part of what it means to be a complete human being. But then, the shaping begins. Parents, teachers, religion, society, all of them, with varying degrees of kindness and violence, begin the process of deciding which parts of you are acceptable and which parts must be hidden. Be quiet. Be still. Be nice. Don't be selfish. Don't be angry. Don't want too much. Don't need too much. Don't be too much. and piece by piece, the unacceptable parts are cut away from the self you present to the world and pushed somewhere else. Jung called this somewhere else the shadow. And here is where it gets important. The shadow is not destroyed by being hidden. It does not shrink because you refuse to look at it. It grows, fed by everything you suppress, strengthened by every authentic impulse you redirect into performance, expanded by every year you spend being who you are supposed to be rather than who you actually are. Jung watched this happen in his patients for decades. People who had spent their entire lives being good, being agreeable, being safe. And then, sometimes suddenly, sometimes slowly, the shadow broke through. Not as a choice, as a collapse. The devoted husband who destroyed his marriage in one inexplicable moment. The gentle colleague whose rage finally surfaced in a way that cost them everything. The deeply spiritual person whose hidden resentments quietly poisoned every relationship they ever had. Jung said these were not failures of character. They were the inevitable consequence of a shadow that had never been acknowledged. A river does not stop flowing because you build a wall across it. It finds another way through. And the longer you force it underground, the more pressure it builds. But Jung went further. He said the shadow does not just contain what you were taught to be ashamed of. It contains something else, something you were never told was buried alongside the darkness. And this is where everything changes. What the shadow actually contains. Most people assume the shadow is purely negative, the rage, the envy, the selfishness, the parts of the self that society correctly identifies as dangerous. Jung agreed those were there, but he said something that most people who study him never fully absorb. The shadow also contains your unlived life, your unspoken needs, your unclaimed power, the creativity you were told was impractical, the anger that, if expressed rather than suppressed, would have protected you from people who treated you badly. The ambition that, if acknowledged rather than buried, would have built something real instead of a comfortable nothing. The assertiveness that would have ended the relationships that were slowly erasing you. Jung called this the gold in the shadow, the genuine power that went underground alongside everything you were ashamed of. And he said, the person who never integrates their shadow loses not just the darkness, they lose the gold. They live their entire lives at a fraction of their actual capacity, performing a version of themselves that is acceptable to everyone and fully alive to no one, including themselves. But here is where Jung stopped describing the problem and started describing the most important process available to a human being. He called it individuation, and what it requires is something most people spend their entire lives successfully avoiding. Most people who hear about the shadow think the work is becoming more honest about their flaws, admitting they are sometimes selfish, acknowledging they sometimes feel envy, confessing the dark thoughts they would never act on. Jung said this is the beginning of the work, not the work itself. The real work is confronting the specific lie at the center of your self-image, the story you tell yourself about who you are that requires the shadow to stay hidden. Because here is the truth most people never say out loud. You do not suppress your shadow because you are afraid of others. You suppress it because you are afraid of what it would mean about you if you acknowledged it was there. The person who has never acknowledged their capacity for cruelty cannot be trusted with power. Not because they are evil, but because their unexamined cruelty will express itself in ways they cannot predict or control. The person who has never acknowledged their need for recognition will destroy relationships trying to get it in ways they will never consciously connect to that need. The person who has never acknowledged their anger will find it leaking into every interaction in the specific passive way that is somehow more damaging than the anger itself would have been. Jung called this projection. The shadow does not stay hidden. It attaches itself to other people. You see your unacknowledged rage in the aggressive colleague. You see your unacknowledged envy in the person you inexplicably dislike. You see your unacknowledged need for power in the leader you cannot stop criticizing. The things that trigger you most consistently are not random. They are the fingerprints of your own shadow on the world.
And this is where Jung offered the most liberating and most demanding truth he ever wrote. Not how to eliminate the shadow. That is impossible. But how to do the one thing that changes everything. Jung called it shadow integration. Not shadow elimination, not shadow suppression. Integration. The process of bringing what is hidden into conscious relationship with the self, not acting it out, not performing it, simply seeing it, acknowledging it, saying, I know you are there. I understand what you want. I am choosing what to do with you. That choice, made consciously rather than unconsciously, is the difference between a person driven by their shadow and a person who has integrated it. Nietzsche understood a version of this from the outside. He watched people perform goodness while denying the will to power he believed was fundamental to human nature. And he said the performance without the acknowledgement was the most dangerous thing a civilization could produce. Not because darkness is good, because darkness that is unacknowledged does not disappear. It governs from underneath. The Stoics touched the same truth from a different direction. Marcus Aurelius, writing alone in his private journal, did not perform virtue. He struggled toward it, honestly, documenting his failures, acknowledging his anger, confessing his impatience. Not to a therapist, not to the empire, to himself. That private reckoning with everything he was capable of is what made his public virtue genuine rather than performed. 3 traditions, 3 centuries, all pointing at the same practice. The examined life is not the life that has no shadow. It is the life that has looked at its shadow clearly and chosen consciously what to do with what it found. Because when you integrate the shadow, when you stop running from the parts of yourself you were taught were unacceptable, something happens that cannot be manufactured any other way. You become whole. Not perfect. Whole. There is a specific quality that whole people have that is immediately recognizable and almost impossible to describe. A steadiness, a groundedness, the specific calm of someone who has met themselves fully and is no longer afraid of what they found. People who have integrated their shadow do not perform goodness. They choose it every time, from a place of genuine power rather than fear. Their kindness is real because it is not the only option available to them. Their patience is real because it is chosen rather than enforced by the suppression of everything else. Their boundaries are real because they no longer need everyone's approval to feel safe. And the relationships that whole people have are completely different from the relationships built on performance, because the people around them can feel the difference between someone who is being kind because they have no other options and someone who is being kind because they chose it. One creates dependence. The other creates respect. Jung spent his entire career watching people become whole, and he said it was the most difficult thing a human being could undertake, because it required them to grieve the version of themselves they had been performing for everyone they loved, to admit that the good person they had been presenting was not a lie exactly, just incomplete, just a fraction of the full human being that was always there, waiting underneath the performance, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting to be integrated.
waiting to finally be allowed to come home. Go back to that buried version of yourself, the anger you swallowed, the ambition you called arrogance, the need you called weakness, the voice that said no when you said yes to keep the peace. Now you know what that was. That was not the worst of you. That was the most honest of you. And every year you spent keeping it in the basement was a year you spent at a fraction of your actual capacity, living a life that was acceptable to everyone and fully inhabited by no one. Jung did not promise that integration would be comfortable. He never lied to you about that. Looking at your shadow clearly is one of the most difficult things a human being can do, because it requires you to admit that you are capable of everything you have ever judged in others, that the line between the person you are and the person you are afraid of becoming is thinner than you have allowed yourself to believe. But he promised something that no amount of suppression can offer, that on the other side of that honest encounter with everything you are, not just the acceptable parts, but all of it, there is a version of yourself that is finally real, finally whole, finally free from the exhausting performance of being only what others decided was acceptable. The shadow is not your enemy. It never was. It is the part of you that has been waiting in the dark for you to finally come and bring it home. You were never too much. You were just never fully met. Not even by yourself. Until now. Drop one word in the comments. The one quality you have been hiding from the world. Not an explanation, not a justification, just the word. Because naming it is the first act of bringing it home. And you are not alone in the basement. I read every one.